Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're going deep, really deep into the idea of legitimate opposition based on, well, the book with the same name.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating look at how.
It is, and it's something I think a lot of people are thinking about these days, especially with so much going on around the world. We see challenges to democratic norms and processes in so many places.
Right. Yeah. And this book really gets to the heart of why that matters.
Like, why is it such a big deal if people can't disagree peacefully, or try to change things through established rules?
It's not just about having a nice polite debate. This book makes a pretty strong case that having these ways for people to oppose the government, to dissent, it's not just some extra feature of a perfect democracy. It's like a fundamental principle, something crucial for any political system that, aims to be stable and just.
Okay, so that's a really big claim. I mean, we're not just talking about democracies here, right?
No, not at all. The book actually spends a lot of time looking at historical examples like ancient Athens and Rome, where you had these systems of opposition that were quite robust, even though they weren't democracies in the way we think of them today.
So it's like, even if a system isn't perfect, this idea of legitimate opposition can still be valuable, even necessary.
Exactly. And it's especially important in those imperfect systems because it can provide a way for people to have a voice, to exert some influence without resorting to, more extreme or violent means.
So we're talking about things like protests, organizing political parties, running for office, speaking out against policies you disagree with, all within the bounds of, accepted rules and norms.
Right. The book really emphasizes this idea of regulated rivalry, which I think captures it well. It's not about everyone always agreeing, but about having a structured way to disagree and compete.
So to be clear, the book isn't saying that all opposition is good or that any kind of dissent is automatically legitimate. There are definitely boundaries.
Of course. The book talks about this in terms of nonviolent competition. So things like, political violence or attempts to overthrow the government through illegal means. Those are obviously outside the bounds of legitimate opposition.
And it's important to remember that the book itself isn't taking sides or endorsing any particular political viewpoint. It's really more of an analysis and exploration of this concept across different times and places.
Right. The goal is to understand what this idea of legitimate opposition is, why it matters, and how it works or doesn't work in different contexts.
I think it's also worth mentioning that the book doesn't shy away from looking at how legitimate opposition is under threat today. Like, it talks about things like rising populism, the erosion of democratic norms, and the ways in which governments are trying to silence dissent.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you just have to look at what's been happening in recent years, like, attempts to overturn election results, crackdowns on protests, and the spread of disinformation.
All very real and very worrying trends.
Definitely. And the book argues that understanding this concept of legitimate opposition can help us make sense of these trends and hopefully find ways to push back against them.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the weeds, let's lay out the book's main arguments up front.
Sure.
So as we said, the book's central thesis is that this idea of legitimate opposition is not just some nice-to-have feature of a perfect democracy. It's a fundamental constitutional principle, something essential for any political system that wants to be stable and just. And it argues this by looking at a whole bunch of historical examples to show how this kind of organized, peaceful competition has played out in different eras, from ancient Greece to the present day.
Exactly. And one of the key points it makes is that allowing for legitimate opposition gives people a vital way to participate in politics, to have a say, to try and shape their own destiny, even if they don't agree with those in power. And it's precisely this ability to voice dissent, to challenge the status quo, that can help prevent things from boiling over into more extreme or violent forms of conflict.
Right, so it's almost like a safety valve. You give people a way to let off steam, to address their grievances through established channels, and it makes it less likely that they'll resort to, more destructive means.
That's a good way to put it.
And the book goes even deeper, exploring why this principle is so important even in systems that aren't fully democratic. It argues that even in less than ideal circumstances, legitimate opposition can still provide a crucial avenue for people to exercise political agency, to have some influence over their own lives and their communities.
And this is where the book introduces what it calls the adversarial conception of legitimate opposition, which I think is really interesting. It's basically saying that instead of focusing on some perfect ideal of how politics should work, We need to look at how it actually functions in the real world, which is often messy and full of conflict.
Yeah, it's like people have different interests, different values, different ideas about how things should be run, and those differences are going to play out in the political arena, whether we like it or not.
Right. And the book argues that instead of trying to suppress those differences or pretend they don't exist, we should create systems that can channel them in a productive way. That's what legitimate opposition is all about. It's about acknowledging and managing those inevitable conflicts within a set of rules and norms that everyone agrees to abide by.
Okay, so let's dive into this adversarial conception a bit more. What are some of the key elements of this idea, and how does it differ from other ways of thinking about opposition?
Well, one of the main things it emphasizes is that legitimate opposition is about more than just keeping the government in check or holding it accountable. It's about giving people a real sense of agency, a feeling that they can actually have an impact on the political process, even if they're not in the majority.
And the book actually defines agency in a really specific way.
Yeah. Yeah. It talks about it as the capacity to form your own desires, to make judgments about the world, to choose your intentions, and to reflect on your actions. It's basically about having the ability to shape your own life and make meaningful choices, even within the constraints of a political system.
Which, let's be honest, can be pretty significant constraints in some cases.
Absolutely. But the book's point is that even within those constraints, even if you don't have complete control, having some degree of agency, some ability to influence things, is still incredibly valuable.
And this is where the book distinguishes its view from those more idealistic accounts of political agency that say, true agency can only exist if everyone is perfectly equal and there's complete consensus on everything.
Yeah, it's like those theories that say true collective action can only happen if we all share the same values and goals and we all agree on how to achieve them.
Which, let's face it, is a pretty unrealistic scenario in most cases.
Totally. So the book is arguing for a more pragmatic view, recognizing that political competition is often messy, that people are going to disagree, and that power imbalances are often a reality. But even within those limitations, it's still possible for people to exercise what it calls adversarial agency.
Okay, so what does that mean? Adversarial agency. How does that work in practice?
Well, it's about recognizing that even if you don't agree with everything the government is doing, you can still participate in the system, you can still try to push for changes you want to see, and you can still try to block things you disagree with.
It's about engaging in the contest, even if you don't always win.
Right. And the book actually lays out 6 key features of oppositional systems that help facilitate this kind of adversarial agency.
Okay, let's hear them.
First off, the outcomes of political contests can't be predetermined. There has to be a genuine possibility of change. It can't just be a rigged game.
Right. There's got to be some uncertainty, some actual stakes involved.
Exactly. Second, these systems have to allow for ways to exercise agency that go beyond just voting. It's about things like organizing, protesting, lobbying, and participating in public debate.
Yeah, it's about having multiple avenues to make your voice heard, not just showing up at the ballot box every few years.
Right. And third, these systems need to have ways for people to coordinate their actions, to form groups and coalitions to pursue shared goals. It's recognizing that collective action is often more effective than individual action in politics.
Makes sense. There's strength in numbers, as they say.
Exactly. Fourth, there need to be structured opportunities for people to actually participate in the political process, like, regular elections, open debates, public hearings, things like that.
Yeah, so it's not just about having the right in theory, but also about having practical mechanisms to exercise that right.
Exactly. Fifth, there have to be ways for people to signal their support or opposition to different political actors and ideas. That's where things like, free speech, a free press, and the ability to assemble and protest peacefully come in.
So it's about being able to express your views without fear of reprisal, basically.
Exactly. And finally, there need to be mechanisms, however imperfect, for holding those in power accountable. That could involve things like independent courts, legislative oversight, or even just the threat of being voted out of office in the next election.
So it's about having checks and balances, ways to make sure that power isn't being abused.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a really helpful breakdown. So according to this book, these 6 features are basically the essential ingredients for a system that allows for legitimate opposition and adversarial agency.
That's right. And the book argues that when these features are present, even if the system isn't perfect, it can still provide a crucial avenue for people to participate in politics, to have a voice, and to try to shape their own future.
It's about recognizing that even in the face of power imbalances and inevitable conflicts, people can still have a meaningful say in how they're governed.
Exactly.
Now, the book also acknowledges that there are some, more pessimistic views out there about the effectiveness of opposition, even in relatively democratic systems.
Yeah, it talks about people like Adam Przeworski, who's argued that the choices people face in elections are often so limited that it doesn't really matter who they vote for. The outcomes are basically predetermined by powerful interests.
So it's like, even if you have the right to vote, it doesn't necessarily mean you have any real power.
That's the argument, yeah. But the book pushes back against this, saying that even when the choices aren't ideal, there's still value in being able to choose, in being able to try to influence things within those constraints. It's about making the best of a less than perfect situation.
I could see that. It's like, even if you can't completely change the system, you can still try to steer it in a slightly better direction.
Exactly. And by participating in the process, by making your voice heard, you're at least signaling what you want, what you value, and what you're willing to fight for.
Right. It's about sending a message, even if it doesn't lead to immediate change.
Exactly.
The book also makes a really interesting distinction between this agency-based argument for opposition and those that are more focused on just controlling or limiting the power of the government.
Yeah, it contrasts its view with what's sometimes called the neo-Republican approach, which is all about preventing domination or arbitrary rule.
So it's like the focus there is on making sure that the government doesn't have too much power, that it can't just do whatever it wants.
Right. And the book argues that while that's important, it's not the whole story. It's not enough to just have a government that's limited in its power. You also need to have a system where people can actively participate, where they can hold the government accountable, where they can push for change.
So it's not just about limiting power, it's about empowering people.
Exactly.
And to illustrate this, the book uses a really interesting thought experiment. It asks us to imagine what it calls an attentive autocracy, which is basically a system where the rulers are very well informed about the needs of the people, and they genuinely try to do what's best for them, but the people have no real say in how they're governed.
Right. So it's like, imagine a benevolent dictator who knows everything about what the people want and need and tries to provide it for them. But the people have no way to influence the dictator's decisions.
And the book argues that even in that scenario, something really important is missing. It's not just about having your basic needs met. It's about having the freedom to shape your own destiny, to make choices about how you're governed.
Right. It's about having that sense of agency, that feeling that you're not just a passive recipient of someone else's decisions.
I like how the book puts it. It says that even in its messy, imperfect forms, legitimate opposition shows respect for the agency of political participants in a way that's often completely absent when opposition is suppressed.
Yeah. And it uses a really powerful analogy to the film Cool Hand Luke to illustrate this point. Where even in the face of overwhelming and brutal power, the main character, Luke, keeps resisting, keeps asserting his own will, keeps refusing to be completely subjugated.
Right. And the point is that even in a situation where you're clearly going to lose, that act of resistance, that refusal to just give in, is still incredibly important because it preserves some sense of agency, some sense of dignity.
Exactly. It's about showing that you're not just a cog in the machine, that you're a human being with your own thoughts, feelings, and values.
And that's something that's worth fighting for, even if the odds are stacked against you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the value of legitimate opposition, even in imperfect systems. But the book also spends a good chunk of time looking at the ways in which opposition is under attack in the contemporary world.
Yeah, and it identifies populism as one of the biggest threats.
Right, and this is something we see playing out in different countries around the world, isn't it?
Definitely. And the book's point is that populism, by its very nature, tends to be hostile to the idea of legitimate opposition. Because populists often claim to be the sole and authentic representatives of the people, anyone who disagrees with them is seen as an enemy of the people, as illegitimate, as somehow unpatriotic.
So it's like they create this very stark us versus them dynamic where there's no room for compromise or even just respectful disagreement.
Right, and this can be incredibly dangerous because it undermines the very foundation of a democratic system, which is supposed to be about allowing for different viewpoints and interests to compete peacefully.
It's like they're saying, if you're not with us, you're against us, which leaves very little room for any kind of meaningful opposition.
Exactly. And the book highlights the difficulty of relying on a purely democratic conception of legitimate opposition when you have large segments of the population who don't necessarily share a commitment to democratic norms or to the idea of respecting different viewpoints.
Right. It's like if people don't believe in the basic rules of the game, then it's very hard to play the game fairly.
Exactly.
And the book also talks about this other type of regime, what it calls electoral autocracies, which are sort of like democracies in name only.
Yeah, they hold elections. They might even have multiple political parties, but there's no real chance for the opposition to actually win power. The system is rigged in favor of the ruling party or leader.
So it's like they're trying to create this illusion of democracy while actually suppressing any genuine competition.
Exactly. And the book points out that these kinds of regimes often use elections for very different purposes than democracies do. They might use them to, shore up support for the regime, to gather information about potential opponents, or even just to create a sense of legitimacy for themselves on the international stage.
But the point is that there's no real possibility of change through the electoral process.
Right. And the book makes a really important point about how these regimes that are undermining legitimate opposition don't just stop at blocking people's ability to participate in politics. They often go further, actively trying to distort people's capacity to even make genuine choices.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it talks about things like coercing people into supporting the government, even if they disagree, or creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation that discourages any kind of dissent.
So it's not just about preventing people from acting, it's about trying to control how they think and feel.
Right. And the book uses the example of the opposition in Venezuela to illustrate this. They've been facing this incredibly difficult dilemma of whether or not to even participate in elections, knowing that the system is rigged against them.
Right. It's like a no-win situation. If they participate, they're lending legitimacy to a corrupt system. But if they boycott, they're basically giving up any chance of influencing things from within.
Exactly. And it really highlights how insidious the erosion of legitimate opposition can be. It's not just about preventing people from voting or speaking out. It's about trying to undermine their very capacity to make free and informed choices.
It's really disturbing when you think about it that way.
It is. And the book connects this to the idea of post-totalitarian systems, drawing on the work of Václav Havel.
Oh, right. He talked about the idea of living within a lie, didn't he?
Exactly. And the point is that these kinds of regimes try to get people to participate in these rituals and practices that reinforce the system, even if they don't actually believe in it.
It's like even by going along with this charade, you're helping to perpetuate it.
Right. And it really speaks to the psychological damage that these kinds of systems can inflict on people, making it harder for them to even imagine alternatives.
Okay, so we've talked about why legitimate opposition is so valuable, and we've talked about some of the ways it's being threatened today. The book also takes a really interesting historical approach, looking at different examples of opposition throughout history to see how this idea is played out in different contexts.
Yeah, and one of the most fascinating examples it explores is ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy.
Right, and what's interesting is that the book argues that the Athenian system of opposition wasn't primarily focused on what we might call ideological differences.
Yeah, it wasn't so much about, liberals versus conservatives or left versus right. It was more about preventing any one individual or faction from accumulating too much power, regardless of their particular political views.
So it's more about like the structure of power itself rather than the specific content of policies or ideologies.
Exactly. And the book talks about the Athenian practice of ostracism, which was basically a way to temporarily exile someone who was seen as having become too powerful or influential.
Right. And it's fascinating because it wasn't a punishment for any crime or wrongdoing. It was more like a preemptive measure, a way to prevent someone from potentially abusing their power or disrupting the balance of the system.
Exactly. And it highlights a really different way of thinking about the boundaries of opposition, one that's more focused on the distribution of power rather than the content of ideas.
Right. It's like they recognize that even someone with good intentions, if they become too powerful, could pose a threat to the system as a whole.
Exactly. And they built mechanisms into their political system to guard against that.
Okay, so the Athenian example is really interesting. The book also looks at ancient Rome, right?
It does. And it makes a really important point about how the Roman system, even though it wasn't a democracy in the modern sense, still recognized the value of opposition and competition.
Right. They didn't have the same kind of elections or political parties that we do today, but they still had these mechanisms for different factions and individuals to compete for power and influence.
Yeah, and the book quotes the historian Andrew Lintott, who said that Rome's enduring legacy was its understanding that opposition and competition were actually desirable and legitimate components of both liberty and effective government.
So it's like they saw conflict and disagreement as a natural part of politics, and they actually tried to harness it in a productive way.
Exactly. And the book argues that for much of the Republic's history, the system actually worked pretty well. It allowed for different viewpoints to be aired, for different interests to be represented, and for power to be somewhat balanced.
But of course, the Roman Republic eventually collapsed. What
Yeah.
happened?
Well, the book argues that the system ultimately broke down because it became too disconnected from the realities of power distribution. As wealth and military might became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few powerful individuals, the established rules of political competition became less and less effective at managing those imbalances.
So it's like the system was designed for a certain kind of political landscape, and when that landscape shifted dramatically, the system couldn't adapt.
Exactly. And the book points to Julius Caesar's rise to power as a prime example of this. He basically used his military strength to bypass the traditional political processes and seize control, effectively ending the Republic and ushering in the Roman Empire.
So it's a cautionary tale about the fragility of even well-established systems of legitimate opposition when the underlying power dynamics shift too dramatically.
Absolutely. And the book argues that this is a lesson we should keep in mind today, especially in a world where wealth and power are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few individuals and corporations.
Right. It's like we need to make sure that our political systems are robust enough to withstand those kinds of pressures.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've talked about ancient Athens, we've talked about ancient Rome. The book also delves into more modern history, looking at the development of opposition in the context of the rise of the modern state.
Yeah, and one of the key arguments it makes is that to really understand legitimate opposition, we need to look beyond just the emergence of political parties and focus on the role of the state itself.
Okay, that's interesting. So what's the connection the book draws between the state and legitimate opposition?
Well, it argues that the state, with its vast resources and power, creates both the need for and the conditions for organized opposition.
Okay, so let me see if I understand this. Because the state is so powerful, it's more likely to overreach, to abuse its power, or to ignore the needs and interests of certain groups. So you need some kind of countervailing force, some way to push back against that power.
Exactly. And the book argues that organized opposition, whether it takes the form of political parties, social movements, or just groups of citizens who are willing to speak out, is the most effective way to do that.
Like, the state creates the problem, and legitimate opposition is the solution.
In a way, yeah. And the book uses the example of David Hume's idea of a perfect commonwealth to show that this understanding of the importance of opposition predates the development of modern party systems.
Right. Hume was writing in the 18th century, and he already saw the need for some kind of structured opposition within a political system.
Exactly. And the book also looks at figures like Bolingbroke in early 18th century Britain, who argued for a formed opposition to the government as a way to check the power of the crown and its ministers.
So it's like they recognize that even in a system that's supposed to have a balance of power, you still need this active, organized force pushing back against those in power.
Right. And the book also discusses Edmund Burke, who's often seen as the father of modern conservatism, and his embrace of partisan activity as a necessary part of a healthy political system.
Okay, so even though Burke is associated with, tradition and order, he still saw the value of having this kind of adversarial element within politics.
Exactly. And the book argues that this understanding of the importance of organized opposition was really a continuation of this earlier tradition, not a radical break from it.
It's like they were building on this idea that had been developing for centuries.
Right.
Now, the book also offers a critique of J.S. Mill's vision of legitimate opposition.
Yeah, it talks about how Mill envisioned a more public-minded, almost apolitical form of opposition, where people would engage in reasoned debate and try to reach consensus on the best course of action.
So it's like a more idealistic, less partisan view of politics.
Exactly. And the book argues that while that's a nice idea, it's not very realistic because it overlooks the role of the state in shaping and influencing the political landscape.
It's like the state isn't just a neutral arbiter. It has its own interests, its own agenda, and it's going to use its power to advance those interests.
Right. So the book argues that we need a more robust understanding of opposition, one that recognizes the power dynamics at play and the need for organized groups to counter the state's influence.
Okay, so we've seen how the book traces this idea of legitimate opposition through different historical periods, from ancient Greece and Rome to 18th century Britain. It also delves into the French Revolution, doesn't it?
It does. And it focuses on how the French revolutionaries, at least initially, tried to create a system that was almost entirely devoid of political competition.
So it's like they were trying to create a system based on pure unity and consensus.
Right. They really believed that if they could just design the institutions correctly, they could eliminate the need for factions and parties and create a system where everyone would work together for the common good.
And how did that work out?
Well, not so well. The book points out that despite their best intentions, political divisions and conflicts emerged almost immediately. People naturally formed different groups and alliances, and they started competing for power and influence.
So it's like even in a revolution that was supposed to be about unity and equality, those inherent human tendencies towards competition and disagreement still asserted themselves.
Exactly. And the book argues that this is a really important lesson for us today, especially for those who think that we can somehow create a perfectly harmonious political system where everyone gets along and there's no conflict.
Right. It's like the French Revolution is a cautionary tale about the limits of trying to engineer a society without acknowledging the realities of human nature and the inevitability of political disagreement.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we wrap up, I think it's worth going back to the book's core argument, which is that this idea of legitimate opposition is a vital constitutional principle, something that's essential for any political system that aims to be stable and just, whether it's a democracy or not.
Right. And it argues that this principle provides a crucial avenue for political agency, allowing people to participate in politics, to have a voice, to try to shape their own future even when they disagree with those in power. And it also argues that this ability to voice dissent, to challenge the status quo, is a key factor in preventing more extreme or violent forms of conflict.
So it's not just about protecting individual rights or promoting democracy. It's also about creating a more stable and peaceful society.
Exactly.
And the book ends with a really thought-provoking question, doesn't it?
It does. It asks us to consider how we can best cultivate and protect the institutions of legitimate opposition in a world where those institutions are increasingly under threat.
Right. Because if we don't find ways to strengthen those institutions and to defend this fundamental principle, we risk sliding into more authoritarian forms of government where dissent is silenced and the possibility of meaningful change is severely limited.
Exactly. And it's a question that I think all of us need to grapple with, regardless of our political beliefs.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive into legitimate opposition. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure discussing this really important topic with you.
We encourage all of you to check out the book for yourselves and to think deeply about the ideas we've explored today. And if you're interested in learning more about these kinds of topics, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into political thought and history.
Until next time.
Take care.